To be talking a lot about the beginning of the end. And I don't mean that in any really doom and gloom way, but this is the beginning of the end of the year. And I tend to focus beyond the holidays while in the holidays because that's what you start thinking about when you are winding down your year. What has transpired this year, what has gone well, and what things needed to be improved. But this beginning of the end also is an intention to encompass all of the holiday seasons. I know that yesterday I made a comment about Christmas in particular because of my background, but the point of it is that I really hope everybody's enjoying this holiday season, this year end, this time of winding down and preparing for the next year. And so today we're going to be talking about role play in terms of being a player and why we do it. And we're also going to be talking about some tips that'll help game masters. And ultimately, we're going to talk about those situations which you may have in your life wherein you are already a role player and don't even know it. So let's get started, shall we? All right, so I got to get my cameras right. I'm looking at the wrong place. That's way over there. I don't want to do that. I'm going to switch cameras. Sorry about this, folks. Alrighty. So use this camera. All right. This portion of Game Master's Toolbox is where I'm assisting storytellers and game masters to have outstanding games at their tables. And today we're going to talk about how to make lore legendary. Now, most of you who are storytellers and game masters have very strong ideas of what you want to have happen in your game sessions. Perhaps you are very focused on player relations and how players can control the story and drive the story. Perhaps you are a more traditionalist where you are utilizing somebody else's printed material and therefore you are building on stories that somebody else has written. Or perhaps you're like me, a complete renegade, and you've come up with your own drive and mechanism and you want everybody to play within that. The real kicker is you have to make sure that you're providing information to the players that make them want to continue to follow that story. And to do that, you need to make each moment memorable. And so we're going to talk about how we create a momentous event every time. So the first thing we're going to talk about is creating the epic from the beginning. And while it seems like an impossibility, in another way, every single story can be epic. It's just a matter of how it's played out and how you present it and what the players can interact with. You want to create your villains so that they're particularly vile. And there are some great statements throughout history that have really come to mind. And one of them is that it's as important in virtuoso music to play the silences every bit as greatly as you play the notes. And in this case, you don't have to really particularly make the villains vile by describing them as such, but you can leave allegory, hints, suggestions, and other minor details that make the villain particularly a bad guy. For example, I had an adventure where one of the gentlemen that was the bad guy was visiting the local community's children while they slept. And I never specified what happened, but other than he was there. And that's enough to creep people out. And this makes the villain somebody that the players want to take out, eliminate, bring to justice. And creating villainy and unscrupulous behavior, even if you're doing it in a narrative form, you are giving the players the ability to fill in the gaps in their own minds and therefore exacerbate or amplify the effect. The next thing is you want to give the players the unassailable high ground. The greatest adventuring high, if you will, for adventurers to know that they fought against a great evil, and yet because of their morally correct position, they are going to overcome. So by giving them the high ground, not making them wonder about whether or not the person they're chasing is really a bad guy or not, you're able to allow them to feel that sort of runner's high of pursuing the objective. The next thing is you want to give that the danger of the adventure needs to be visceral. They need to feel like they're hanging by their fingernails from the cliff face, if that's what's going on, or they need to feel the cold blast of the wind in their face. And when they are able to experience these things through the engagement, then they can feel like their part of the story is dramatic. If they are worried that they are going to fall off the cliff, or that they're going to lose their gear, or whatever, if they're worried and concerned, they're going to be playing more strongly into the story. And so you want to make sure that the dangers are strong enough or are descriptive enough so that the players actually are concerned. If you've set up an environment where the players are never do any wrong or never face any real dangers, they never will make any risks because there's no reward, there's no upside, there's no dangerous downside. So you want to make sure that the highs and lows are really valid. This is also important, that when a player makes a mistake in a game or makes a bad decision in a game, roll with it, play with it, because the greatest successes of all are when you overcome a misstep. Throughout history, it's always the mistakes that lead to the greatest learning curves, and the most excitement in stories are when somebody's caused some confusion or put themselves in a predicament and the others have to rescue them. By doing this and allowing the players' mistakes to become momentous and an opportunity for miraculous things to happen, naturally the other players are going to do what they can to assist in that more positive outcome. And you also have to limit and moderate the failure factors. One of the biggest challenges in any roleplay game from a game master standpoint is the possibility that the dice will not fall in your favor. And so it's really important to define and design your adventures so that the players have the opportunity to make actions, and that you are mitigating and moderating the actual risk that they're facing, so that it's never left to a random die factor. Yeah, you certainly want there to be failure involved for the purpose of building dramatic tension, but you're not there per se to kill them off. And so, because obviously you could, as a game master, simply wipe the board with them. But the point is that you need to basically provide them a way to feel the risk and reward, and limit and moderate the failure function so that the successes will inevitably stack up so that they gain the victory overall. Enthusiasm and effort should overcome errors. So if they put themselves in a bad situation, if they are going about it in the right way, if they are endeavoring to succeed, etc., these things should cover, as the saying goes, a multitude of sins. You need to provide them, therefore, the way to move forward, even if they've made some bad missteps and things have gotten more dangerous. Ultimately, when you are completed with an adventure and the players are talking about it later, listen for the pieces that are legendary. And what I mean by that is when they remember, oh yeah, Charlie dropped his sword and they were about to get him, but we remember how we rescued him. That's the part. Those are the parts that become the legend. Those are the parts that build the myth. It's the missteps and the return to success thereafter that they measure. So provide them the opportunities, put them in the positions, and then let them be awesome. That's really what it comes down to. If you want your adventures and your lore to be legendary, let the players figure out how to pull victory from the jaws of defeat. All right, now we're going to talk about more specifics for your game master, and this is a checklist of some variables. You couldn't possibly make a complete list of all possible variables for any given scene, let alone for all generic scenes. So this is a a rather comprehensive but nowhere near a complete list of all possible variables that you might have in an adventure sequence in your roleplay game. But this is just some ideas of things that you'll want to at least touch on, or at least have in your mind as you're building out the scene. And this is referring to the establishment shot, the beginning portion. Of course, the actual dynamics of how the game plays out is going to be up to the players and their interactions. But these are the things that you'll want to look at on how you can set it up in advance so that the scene can be awesome. The first thing is you're going to need a narrative description. And while in the motion picture business they kind of frown on straight narrative, nonetheless, in many cases the players need some form of establishing shot. They need to know what the location looks like. They want to know where it is in reference to the maps that you've created, if you have any. If not, they may not matter. It may be as they're just traveling along, and so therefore it won't be that important. But it does help to set up what variables that they have to consider while playing. So these would be things like the climate, weather, and natural conditions. Are you traveling through an area where there are hot springs and therefore natural fog? Are you in a place where there might be torrential rainfall in 1 minute and bone dry and humid the next? The concept of location is more than just the physical latitude, longitude, elevation. You're looking at all kinds of variables that come out of the climate and the location. Obviously, if you set the adventure in a desert and a sandy field, that's going to be a lot different than the same encounter on a marshy street, in a marshy bog, or on a damp, foggy street in London. So the next thing you want to take is into account are any unintentional consequences. If they have put themselves in a situation where their spellcaster is throwing ice and frost spells and it's already cold and slippery, perhaps you're going to have some icy conditions that they didn't consider. Maybe it's that they were traveling by magic and the magic ran out and they were over a bog and therefore they're down in a swampy area. Who knows? But there could also be intentional alterations of the environment. And this could be, a wizard who has created a wall of flame that's going to give a certain condition to that space where the wall of fire is. Or perhaps they've flooded an already swampy area to make it just a soup. There's all kinds of ways that the interaction can be made more unique than just simply by choosing a climate and a location. Perhaps there are distractions or nuisances. If you are in an area where it's boggy and such, I'm sure there are a lot of horrible nuisance insects that can crawl into your boots and be crawling up your legs. And there's all kinds of ways you could cause a distraction. They need to be something at least you consider as you're building out the story. You also want to look at who might be there. Are there any non-participant personnel that are walking through the scene? As you may know, when I speak of non-player personnel, there's all kinds of types that you can consider, whether it be simple window dressing, those that pass through and that's as far as it goes, or it can be a situation where they are non-player characters who were literally walking through the location. They may have information, but they aren't familiar with what's going on in the area, and they therefore are potential casualties, and they can be problematic to the story. So you have to take that into account. And then we come to the things that are more visceral. When you're at the tabletop as a character looking through the scene, what obstructions might be there? If there's a wagon that's moving through, it's going to obscure or block off part of your line of sight. Perhaps you've got to worry about bales of hay or barbed wire fences. There's a myriad of different things that could be obscurances and line of sight blockers. Maybe forest or bushes, etc. You need to also consider any props or ad hoc materials that might be in the area that the players could actually interact with. Maybe there's some long chunks of wood or panels or something that they can interact with and use as defenses, or to even change the appearance of the area themselves. Additionally, you need to consider, especially when you're starting into the adventure, what are the potential and ad hoc escape routes from the location. Certainly, climbing up the face of a sheer wall might be difficult, but choosing instead to wait until you get to a nearby alley and then climbing onto a roof, this may be something that might be considered possible. So you have to think about these things in particular. The next thing, which has to do with story development, is that even before the engagement occurs, are there going to be any stage changing triggers? In other words, if the villains have taken a certain percentage of casualties, they're going to let loose their dogs. That might be something that's going to happen, and so you need to take those kind of commercials didn't warn me. So we are on commercials. While we're on commercials, I don't know what we could do. I could do a riddle. As I was going to St. Ives, I met a man with 7 wives. Each wife had 7 sacks. Each sack held 7 cats. Each cat had 7 kits. Kits, cats, sacks, and wives. How many are going to St. Ives? And if that one's too easy, we could do... I've got still 1:27. 30 white horses on a red hill. Now they tramp, now they stamp, now they stand still. Or you've decided to take a job driving a bus, and so you drive down the road and you pick up 5 passengers and drop off 2, and then you go a little bit further and you drop off 3 and pick up 7, and then you go a little bit further and you drop off the 7 and pick up 11. What's the name of the bus driver? All right, so that's enough being glib and silly. 43 seconds left. All right, okay, we're back from the commercials, and I don't know where I was exactly, so I'm going to back up a little bit. We were talking about... See, I never know when the ads are. I always seem like I'm ahead of them. At any rate, since it says that I'm done and you may not be, I don't know how to do this. We'll figure this out in a minute. All right, so we're talking about the possibility of some props or ad hoc materials that the players might have found in the area. Keeping all of this in mind as you're describing, you can give the hints to the players even before the engagement occurs that they might be able to draw upon. So that's really important. The next are the escape routes. You have an idea of where you'd expect them to try to escape to, or which direction they might travel, and give that information to the players right at the beginning of the engagement so they know where their escape points are. And also, this will therefore also give you the ways and elements of how to let them know sort of in advance where the stage triggers might be. For example, when you see someone coming down the second hallway into this area, that means you know that the villains are aware, and therefore they're going to be ramping up. And so therefore, by giving the players the idea of what the stage triggers might be, you're able to give them the opportunity to plan ahead, or at least respond appropriately to the triggers. Another thing that's kind of difficult in advance to think about is you really should consider when you're going to, quote, call the action. Now, granted, Most role-play games have it so that the monsters must be killed before you can end the scenario. That's certainly one way to do it. Another way would be to have, when a certain number of victories have been accomplished in hand-to-hand combat, maybe it's a number of total hit points that are done, that will trigger the change. In any case, you want to have figured out and worked out for your players what the scene ending parameters will be, and then ultimately some form of denouement. I know that's a French word and most people don't use it, but the idea of denouement is the finalization or clearing out of the scene. If you are fighting with monsters and you've now, sufficiently killed them, what are you doing with the bodies? Are you just leaving them in the streets? Are you going to process them in some fashion? Are you going to leave it for the local authorities? If you don't give that kind of completion or denouement, then later on the players will also feel very confused when you do expect them to have done something. So just get in the pattern of building it into the story so that the entire encounter is complete. All right, now some people are going to ask, oh, it's on the same camera, that's okay. Some people are going to ask, why play role-playing games? And the reality is that role-playing games are really about identity. And part of the challenge of our world today is that a lot of people struggle with what their identity is, who they are, who they're allowed to be, what they are permitted to have as a personality, a presence, and I'm going to be utilizing NycosRPG mechanisms to talk about it, but the reality is that there are ways to actually see how we are actually role-playing every day. Most of us change roles at the drop of a hat and don't even think about it. For example, I'll just use myself. Given my history, I am a former air traffic controller. I'm also a father and until my sisters passed away, I was a brother. I've been a son. I've been a truck driver. I've been, of course, a storyteller, a game master. But I've also been an adventuring elf with a penchant for magic items that had to do with time travel and a Star Trek communicator pin. The kind of relationships that we have in all of reality fundamentally come down to roles anyway. We fulfill different positions in culture all along our pathway, and in some cases we are very devoted to the role, and sometimes we would rather cast that role off into the dirt and be something else. But the reality is that our core, at our fundamental center, we are something that is more than just the statistics. Now, in standard role-play games, they make it so that those numbers might be modifiable by game mechanics. In the case of the world of Nycos, your core stats, your base stats, are your fundamental skeleton. They are what define you. And the reality is, other than picking a role and playing into that role, we don't have that challenge. We are more than what we look like. We are more than what we just do. We are more than what we sound like or look like. And that reality to differentiate who we are compared to what we are or what we present to be it's a challenge. Now, certain of them, if you look at, in the case of many role-play games, they speak of races when they really mean species, but they are speaking of the celebration of variation. When you decide to play in a role-play game, you're going to play a dwarf. You have chosen to play somebody who is of a certain stature. You're of a certain dimension, weight. You're of a certain whatever. These characteristics are only limiting because you chose them, but they are celebrations of the variations that you could have taken, the other options you might have taken, the road, if you will, not taken. In our world, we're kind of stuck with the race of which we are, which is human, and there really isn't that much differentiation between ourselves and those of other cultural backgrounds other than their actual cultures. So we're going to talk about that in a moment, but the point here is that the concept of race in role-play games generally has to be considered to be, speaking of the physical speciation, so to speak, which of course would not apply in a humanocentric modern era or even ancient history realm. If it's here on Earth, there's only been the one species, so to speak. And I know we can get into a big, long, drawn-out battle or war over those kind of conversations, but the reality is that for the purposes of this discussion and in the way I look upon things in general, the concept of race is only referring to the differentiation of our beings, one from the other, in terms that are not breaking the continuum for that particular species. All right. So next is the concept of place, and in the world of Nycos, the word place is actually the defining capsulation of your culture, and this is far more what we in the world today talk about when we're speaking of the quote races. And it really comes down to, in a role play game, what you choose to play. You can choose how you want to approach your culture. Are you going to honor it, or are you going to ignore it? Are you going to draw skill from it, or are you going to kick it to the curb in favor of something else you'd prefer to pursue? So it's not something that defines or describes, but instead it is something that allows you some liberties and alternatives that perhaps those that do not come from that culture wouldn't have. Beyond that, we also have estates, and estates are fundamentally a boxing together, if you will, of a few limited forms of motives, more for clarity in a game mechanism than for objective definitions of persona. The idea here, the motives are your frame of reference. So perhaps you're motivated by intrigue. Maybe you're motivated by politics. Maybe you're motivated by sheer economics. All of these are valid motives, which means they would be equated to estates. And coming from those estates and those motivations, there are certain skills that you would seek to acquire that fit with those estates. And while it's not one-to-one, and certainly there are people who have a life experience that does not parallel this, but the idea is that if you choose to take some solace in the background that you've come from, then you certainly would pick up some skills along the way. And the way you chose to live your life, therefore the estates that you've chosen, would have also put you on a track to pick up some additional skills. Now, the actual skills, the actual things that we learn in life, really comes down to the tendencies we have in our curiosity. What is it we want to look for? What do we want to know? And when that's the case, you as the player, of course, get to choose. And within the realm of possibilities are all the different kinds of occupations you could have. So in the world of Nycos, your ways, your skills tend to fall from occupational pathways. Perhaps you are in the way of roads, so you're worried about travel, commerce, that kind of thing. Perhaps you're in the way of wilds, so you're about hunting and nature sense and discovery along that way. Perhaps you are instead of the way of wonders, and you just want to know how magic works. All of these are possibilities, and they reflect what you as a player choose to do, and your advancement in the game is totally under your control as a player. And that's like reality. If I was an air traffic controller, I chose that pathway at some point in the past, and worked and endeavored to finish the schooling and all of that to make it into that job. And I was an accomplished controller for about a half dozen years. And then I decided to become a truck driver. And each of the variations that we choose gives us a different pile of skills to work through. And therefore, the point here is that where you got your skills also tends to be where you end up on your career. Now, I like the fact that the word career actually also has the second definition. We almost all know that a career is a job pathway, but the word career literally means to bounce around. It means to divert and change direction a lot. And many of us have a career path that does follow that rather than the straight arrow went from cradle to grave doing one job or whatever. The point here is that our career becomes the resting state of our being. And I can kind of prove this to you. When somebody walks up to you on the street and introduces themselves, they ask you inevitably, well, so what do you do? Because what they're looking for is they want to know who you are. But it seems almost rude to ask somebody, well, who are you? Because it seems like you're being insensitive or you're being unaware. And therefore, by asking what they do, you're asking for the default condition. What is your resting state of being? And in my case, I do a litany. I might talk for 10 minutes telling them all the things that I've done in the past. Or I might just default to the most recent of those pathways. But the point is that our career path is not necessarily the pathway of our accomplishments. In other words, if we have endeavored to be particularly good at, I don't know, writing or narrative or arithmetic or engineering, whatever we have as far as accomplishments is a completely different list than perhaps our careers. Maybe we've done things in the job pathway that did lead to advancement and accomplishments, or maybe not. Some of us have jobs that have nothing to do with what we have accomplished. Some painters have worked as, deck builders or whatever. They've done construction, they've done plumbing. And the idea that your career path and your accomplishment path is not the same is suggestive of the different options that we have in the real world that are not, in most cases, emulated in role-play games, because those tend to line you up so that your occupation and your accomplishments are lockstep. You can't do things that are in the wrong pathway. You have to, follow the rules. And then finally, the belongings. So the resting state of being is your careers, but your accomplishments are the evidence of your being, and the things that you can look at in the world and say, I was here and I did this. For example, as an air traffic controller, I have an accomplishment of having an air traffic control operations certificate. I have several commemoration and commendation awards that I got while I was an Air Force sergeant. And the idea that our accomplishments doesn't necessarily follow along exactly with our careers only gives us more leniency to follow the paths that we want, because sometimes the accomplishment pathway is what we prefer compared to the occupational pathways. And then finally, belongings. The stuff that we get is the stuff of enacted imagination. We have what we have because we dreamed up the way to get to those items. Now, some of us will look at it and go, yeah, well, I didn't choose a 1995 Subaru. That wasn't my car of choice. I would have liked a Lamborghini or whatever. But the reality is that the enacted imagination is what we've done to get to that. If we have not generated the energy to move our lives to get to the point of the vehicle that we want, that's a choice that we've made along the way. And the belongings we have are sort of the proof positive of what we have done. The reality is that every state of existence results from our participation in the roles that we've taken for ourselves. And whether it be a goal a lifelong objective that we've rolled into as our role, or whether it's something that we hope for in the future and we just haven't pursued it yet. The elements that bring us to our current state of existence is literally the amount of effort we've put in and number of opportunities that have come before us. And until we have either put ourselves in enough places where the evidentiary can come into play, or we've done enough effort to get there, those two characteristics are the only things that define where we are. And so as we go into the next part, we're going to be talking about some things that will help us in accomplishing that. All right. So we talked about role-playing games. We talked about the idea of engaging, and there's reasons why you should be playing. And when I say playing, you should be living in a playful way wherein you fulfill the roles that you've taken on. Here are some reasons why you need to do that. The first and primary one is that you were made for this. From our childhood, I'm going to commercials, it says the break will end in 2 minutes. If you are on commercial right now, let me know, Miss Titan K, because I do not know when the commercial actually starts for you. I hate to be dead air, so I will probably continue talking, but I will repeat this again. You're made for this. You are designed from the very beginning. When we are born, we have zero perception. We have zero understanding. We have basic senses, but they're not all fully functional. They're not all yet associated with the things that are around us, and we have to learn. And from very young mindsets, we are becoming what others kind of have put us to do. It is an idea. We don't know how to hold a bottle. We don't know how to communicate. So they've proven that much younger children can be learned sign language because physical hand manipulation is quicker than the muscles of the mouth. But the concept of our nature is that we are made to be role players. We are made to fulfill roles within cultures. If we're going into commercial at this point, let me know. Otherwise, I will endeavor to continue. But I think commercials should be over right about now. All right, so we are back. Okay, good. So you're made to be a role player. You are made to fulfill roles within our culture because that's the way human beings work. We, as adults, understand this because we know that we have to be, an occupational breadwinner. We have to be the responsible one to pay the bills. We need to be the one that takes out the trash and cleans up the living room and blah, blah, blah. We have all of these tasks, and because these tasks are related with different beings, our interaction with them changes from place to place and from time to time. And so we have been playing roles all of our lives. When you are at home, you are a child of your parents. You are a kindred of your brothers and sisters. You are related to members outside of that, perhaps, and you can be friends with others. But the point is that you are going to play a role each time because we don't know what the other person expects until we get to know them. And so we play roles with other people until we understand more about them. And then perhaps we might want to afford some more vulnerability and become more acquainted with other people. But the point is that we play a lot of different roles. When we go to school, we are a student. We still give the same level of respect, supposedly, to our educators. But the idea of those educators is that they are not parents. We don't interact with them in the same way. Now, the roles we choose set our pathway for the future. And the Nycos RPG allows this because you can pick from the different pathways, the different courses of livelihood, the occupational paths, if you will, but you're not required to. And you literally could take them from anywhere because anybody could learn juggling. You just have to choose to want to do that. And therefore you become a juggler. But the roles that we choose sets our pathway. And therefore once we set our pathway, then what we do is we start to invoke our own versions of routine. We appreciate routine. And the interesting thing is that the person that we will become over time, while it is dependent upon the roles that we've played, we also find that the roles that we choose are going to fall in line with the things that put us on that path. And so this is why logically you think of a person who becomes a plumber being a plumber for all of their career path. Unlike somebody like me who was owned a business when I was 12. I sold a landscaping business when I was 16 to pay for my time at college. I spent years in the military as an avionics technician on the SR-71. Then I cross-trained into air traffic control. And then after that, I became a truck driver. My choice of paths was much more of a career, as we said before. It's kind of a bounce around thing. But this adaptation has to depend on your ability to improve skills. If you have the skills and you don't practice them, they don't get improved. But as you improve on the skills in your path, then you're more acceptable to that pathway and therefore it becomes easier. And so opportunities, therefore, give us the means to change those up. But when you look at it from the reason of talking about play, is that most of this is pretty dangerous. If you're on one work path, it's awfully hard to just jump off of that work path and go do another one. But play is a great way to examine the possibilities. Play as even silly things like playing operation to see whether or not you've got the hand-eye coordination of being a surgeon. It's not surgery. It really isn't. But it is the idea of playing as a safe way to examine those possibilities. Because in play, you can make mistakes and no one's going to get injured. You can discuss possibilities, and they are only that, just possibilities. And it's important to note also that our perspectives can change by the play, because we might find we don't like something. As in my past, I always told everybody when I was a child that I was going to be either a paleontologist or an astrophysicist. Well, I became neither. The reality is that the changing of your perspective really comes down to what you practiced. I didn't go into those career paths because I had other things that came up in life that I had to pursue instead. So this means that therefore I need to be able to consider them in a playful nature and therefore decide whether or not I want to do them without having endangered the path that I'm already on. Now, this playfulness also tends to overcome anxiety. If you are not familiar with something, it's far better to go and play around. The idea of if you're going to decide to be a roller skater, go put on some roller skates and go and play. Don't try to become a hockey player, day one of skates. You're going to want to have some time where you just play with the idea to see whether or not you can do it, and let that play overcome your anxiety. I have some very good friends who have in their past some rather atrocious things happen, and being able to play through situations that were tangentially similar, let them work through the difficulties that they had in a safe environment. And ultimately, we become what we imagine when we play. There is a great stack of information that has proven over and again that our memory is malleable. And as we consider things in the past, we can, perhaps to our detriment, imagine them differently than they happened. And when we do that, the imaginings become as real as reality, because we can fool our memory. And when you talk about the idea of becoming a more noble person, if you are playing a persona who is more noble and more righteous and such, you get to practice at those things that you would like to have in your life, and that leads to the change in your mind over those things. The reality is that every state of existence results from our participation in the roles that we have created for ourselves. If we are having a tough time and things are not going well in our lives, we have predicated conditions in our lives that will maintain that, because that is what we have become adapted to and are willing to continue. We have to learn to exist in a different state of existence so that our brains can rewire themselves. We can literally create the fiction, if you will, the artificial conditions for which we can become familiar and therefore make them part of our reality. So let's bring this home. Now we're going to talk about reality, and we're going to talk about what kinds of things motivate us. In the world of Nycos, motivations are broken down very generally. You can talk about it from the standpoint of artistry or heartfeltness or mindfulness or pure economic advancement, belongings and possessions, as well as connections and community. But these are all very general. So today we're going to talk about some very specific things that might motivate you. And I don't know in each one of you personally. I know which ones of these I kind of find myself falling into, but we're not going to be making any kind of judgments here. I just want to talk about all the possible ones, and so to put some words into your vocabulary about which ones you might want to consider to start working towards in your own life. Because once you know what it is that drives you, what it is that motivates you, then you have something to grab a hold of to focus your attention on and start to improve those things. So the first thing, there's a ton of people in the world that fight with this one, the idea of self-evaluation and worth. They know they want to be worth something, or they believe that they are worth something. And I'm not giving any definition yet to what that means. But really, when they say that, what they're suggesting is that they need a validation. They need other people to provide feedback that they are worthwhile, that they are valid, that their choices are good. And what's interesting is that this concept of worthiness feels like it should be coming from outside, that someone else should make us worthy, should mark that we are worthy. But the reality is that it is an internal issue that we bring upon ourselves. We can self-validate when we do things that have measurable value. And that measurable value doesn't mean we have to adhere to anybody else's schedule or anybody else's defining terms. Our worthiness, therefore, in associating it with the validation, is that we therefore have to figure out what parameters we're going to set so that we can see our accomplishments in light of those, so that we gain that validation we're looking for. Simplest example, if you've got an issue with your parental units, your mother and your father, and you don't think they find you valuable, you certainly want to see what they see as valued, and then consider what things you are, what conditions you have in your life, and whether or not they fit that. Maybe that ends up being not what you're looking for, because maybe they're impossible to attain or are irrational. Then you've gotten a validation that your sources for worth are the point that's skewed. And so perhaps you need to consider that aspect as well. Tangentially to that, of course, you might have an issue with fame or infamy, that you want to be recognized for your accomplishments. And of course, that also is a sticky wicket because what you do can create recognition only if other people are looking at it. As a short and brief example, I would love to have 1 million followers on this channel. I would love to have people that are embracing what I recommend and things like that. But that's not something that I can create. If I were to create a level of infamy or fame simply by what I do, then the whole concept of recognition becomes invalid, because if all I'm doing is doing it so that I get the recognition, then the recognition itself is hollow and not valued. So it's a push me, pull you, but what again, recognition simply means acknowledgement. I'm not mentioning it here in this page, but the idea that what I'm saying, the very term recognition means that somebody sees me and they remember, right? That's recog. They see you again and remember. And if you're attempting to gain that without doing something, I'm going to switch subjects for a second. One of my favorite quotes is by Ben Franklin, who said, "If you want to be remembered, then write something worth reading or do something worth writing about." And that's kind of stuck with me, because we are either doers or writers or viewers. And as a doer versus a viewer, I'm not wired, if you will, to be looking over my shoulder to see who's looking, who's watching. I just anticipate that what I'm saying is awesome enough that people will watch. I know that that's crazy. But the idea here is that if you're motivated by fame, then you have to be actually motivated by action, because it takes the action to get attention. Perhaps you're driven by the thrill of the unknown. You simply want to know what it's like to be the fastest being on the planet, or the person who has jumped on the bed the most times, or the person that has been to the most hotels in the world, or whatever. These things that we don't know are themselves exciting, and it's thrilling to try to become and to experience these varieties of things. But sometimes just pursuing the thrills really comes down to the exploration. You are wanting to see what the boundaries are. How far can we go? How fast can we go? How high can we go? And these levels of exploration become more and more nuanced the more you do these things. You know, if you say, well, I want to be the person who is the first one to bungee jump off of a certain building or whatever, that's exciting. But if you've also been the person who's jumped the most times from that location, that's also something that's a new or an unknown. The idea is that the thrill slowly will burn out unless you keep finding more things to explore into. And so this exploration becomes more and more nuanced over time. Some people just want to be saved. They feel at a loss. They feel that they need to be rescued. And this sort of associates with the idea of valuation, because you think you have to be redeemed, that you can't do things by yourself. You can't be something valued, that somehow somebody else's rescuing of you shows you are valuable. And you could go around the circle about that thing, but the reality is that looking for redemption is also an honorable path if it leads you to act honorably to justify that redemption. Not that you ever can. The idea that were in a need and someone needed to rescue you, that's a foregone conclusion in this mindset. You need to find some way for redemption. But if that process leads you to be a better person and try to become more because you want to honor and respect that redemption, then that's a very good motivation. Some people prefer a a motivation that is collective in nature. We're all working on this one thing. Many faith communities, many non-religious organizations, and non-government official organizations set themselves up as a collective effort to accomplish something. And this is the essence of cooperation. If your motivation is cooperation, you're wanting to succeed with everybody else being a part of the process and acknowledging the work that all of them are putting together. It's not a selfish motivation, but it is a collective form of motivation. And it has, in some certain cases, extremely strong value, and in others, it may seem a bit flippant. For example, I have some good friends that have worked on projects where they worked cooperatively for no income. They did it just for the fun of it. They just did it because it was something to do collectively. I have some other friends who work with Habitat for Humanity or other. I hate the fact that commercials don't give me an advance. They just tell me when we're already in them. And I don't like to sit with dead air, so. I guess another riddle. No door nor window, gate nor lid, yet within gold treasure is hid. Of course, I'm sure you can figure that one out. A hill full, a hole full, yet you cannot catch a bowl full. Yeah, commercials are annoying. I have to go back and edit these out. All right, so we were actually speaking on the idea of collective efforts that we can have as our motive cooperation, the idea of working together to reach a goal. If you're playing a role-playing game, it's really a powerful one to have the group collectively choose this one. But it doesn't have to be your only motivation. One thing to realize is that each of these motivations could be worked on together. You might have several of these that you use as your drivers or things that progress your life. Just realize that they are all several nuances, and therefore you could pursue them individually or collectively. Next one we talk about is one of the most obvious, and that is payment or reward. The flat out compensation motivation. What are we going to get paid? How much are we going to get? What's our percentage? And while it's perhaps one of the most common and most well understood motivations, to me it's one of the worst motivations, because literally anybody can do anything for any amount of money as long as they can find the person that will pay it. So yes, you could be a garbage collector, but if you are a garbage collector who lives in a major city, you can make pretty steady bank being involved in that occupation. If you are a writer, you can make as much or as little depending on where you are in the echelon of writing and what materials you write and so on. But the idea that compensation is a coursework, I would say it probably spans over a majority of these other ones as a purpose or a motivation for doing the work that we choose to do. Next one is approval or acceptance. And while this one sounds like it's similar to the worthiness aspect we talked about earlier, in this case, what we're talking about is we are confident with what we do. We are confident with the skills that we have, but we want others to acknowledge them. This is most prevalent when you look at things like artists or novelists and such. You want to know that the work that you've done is appreciated by the people for whom you perceive you've done it. As a game master, this is one of my biggest ones. I mean, obviously, if I'm a storyteller, I want to know that the people that are playing in the games that I am running are being supported and understanding and having a good time, and are also feeling valued, validation, and all of the others for their part from being in the game. That these are, I use the word edification here because it literally means the building up, because validation is that you can do it. Edification is not only can you do it, but you can do it well. And so that's what I believe a large majority of people look for, is some form of approval or acceptance of the tasks that they do. Because in accepting the outcomes and rewarding the outcomes with attaboy, good job, etc., you are building up that person's understanding of their very skill base. Now, this one is a little odd. I say self-confidence, and the reality is that we want affirmation. We want to be able to say, I'm a good guy. I do a good job. I'm well heeled at this particular career. I know the subject matter about which I claim to. And so the ability to say that does depend on our own capability of feeling the self-confidence. And it almost seems like an echo chamber, but the reality is that if you are confident about something, but you don't have no validation, you don't have any understanding of what others feel to be your worth, it is puffery. It is being a blowhard. It's not supportive. But if you know that others have said good things about your property, they have definitely said they like your the work that you do, you can have self-confidence because you know that you have received those compliments. So that's the reason why I differentiate affirmation from validation. All right, the next one, I have a very good friend whose entire life motivation is absolutely forbearance and tenacity. They want to finish anything they start. They are going to stick to it forever. And this forbearance and tenacity itself is a motivator, because you got X number of payments until your house is paid off. So set that as your goal. That is a level of tenacity. I'm going to work until I have accomplished whatever this task is. And that is measurable and useful, and now in some cases many might say that it's tedious and annoying to be such a detail person, but the reality is that being able to mark off every time you've succeeded and validate every time you've completed, you are building a arsenal of things for your self-confidence, for future progresses. Some people work to educate others, and in some ways I think that's kind of where my role has evolved, in that as a storyteller with 50 years of experience, I don't want this skill group, if you will, to go away. I want to share everything I know about it, and I am motivated in my ability to educate you as the audience, you as a game master, you as a player, how you can get the most out of your play experience, your work experience, and your life in general, because you can become a playful person, have more joy, reach more objectives, etc., by learning the skills that I'm able to share with you. And that's just an example, again, of one of the things that motivates me. But being an educator, I know some very good teachers that spent their entire lives teaching and sharing and educating, and there's nothing more noble than that kind of an avocation. In like fashion, there are people who want to maintain a legacy. There are people who are dyed in the wool protective of the Dungeons and Dragons franchise, even with the changes in management, even in the changes in direction, even in the changes of outcome. They want to hold on to that, and there is a value to having continuation as an objective. In the world of Nycos, it's 50 years of story that rolls over each other, so therefore there are ways for players to acknowledge the advancement of the groups before, because they can see that legacy in its continuation in this iteration. And the concept here is that you want to be motivated, or you want your motivation of legacy to be about the value of the item, not your value as the only speaker for it, because certainly there are a lot of other things that a person could pursue, and being able to maintain a particular course in your legacy is a continuation, and that continuation can motivate itself. And then the final one here is to challenge perception. And I think if it came down to it, if I was going to number all of these in order, for me, challenging perception for me is important. And that is, I need for you as a viewer to see that when I talk about playing in a role play game and role playing in your life and utilizing the Nycos Launchpad to get to where you want to, those are all three integral things. Because the reality is that our perception of reality is what we bring to the table. And by helping you to understand how you can change your perception to change the outcome is absolutely critical. And that's what the Nycos Launchpad is all about, and really what this entire presentation has been about. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the practical parts of this. And this is a completely different focus. So realize that we're switching gears here. We're now going to talk about how to create what I call the domino wall. And it's actually a 3-stage process. You have to actually decide on your course using a chainstorm. Then you have to define your course by building out the steps of the dominoes. And then you have to pursue your course, which is chip away at each of the dominoes as you go forward, trying to cause a collective collapse, and they all knock down and succeed. So the first thing we have to look at is what I call the causation clause. And the causation clause is basically, how do you see your actions changing your life? If you can't see that you are the only one that can change your life, then we have to start someplace else and work up to that point, because we have to know that the things that happen in our lives are our fault, our responsibility, and to our credit. When we can do that, when we can own the things that are going to happen in our lives, then we have the ability and the tools necessary to make those changes. So just know that our causation clause says that we do what we do. We don't do what others did. We don't do what others might. We do what we do. And therefore, what we must do is figure out what that means for us. And therefore, that means we need to build a consistency chain. You see, the reality is that the majority of us desire or want or advocate for or pursue routine. My dad was in sales his entire life. Yes, he did. He drove a truck sometimes. Yes, he did other things. But he was his entire life a salesman. And therefore, there were certain routines that he did all of the time throughout his existence. And those pieces that he was the best at were the ones that focused on his ability to sell, which means my dad was great at asking questions. He was great at getting to the details and working through objections. We all do this. We all pick a series of chains and we go with it. So in this case, we're going to talk about how that consistency chain is devised. And that is, of course, we've talked about the last couple of weeks, the idea of the chain storm. We're going to build out the pathway from where we are to where we want to be. And we're going to do it in such a fashion that we can see all of the intermittent steps in advance and determine what the order of them should be. And that chain storm application is what leads to the domino principle. Now, the domino principle is merely this. If you have an objective that is X number of variables long, and you work on each one of those variables slightly each day, at some point they will inevitably follow the direction you intend because you've worked out all of the variables along the way. And then as each one falls, it causes the ones beneath it or beyond it to also fall towards the point of success, to the point where your actual success is actually inevitable. Now, let's talk a bit about the law of intent. I know there are dozens of books out there on the subject, and there are intent coaches, and there are visualists, and all of this. But the reality is that the law of intent is setting your mind in motion. You have to have an imagined source and an imagined conclusion, and you have to work out the variables between and set your mind in motion towards working on all of them. This is important because then it leads to the next part, which is the verbalization, the affirmation, the expression of your intent. And if you cannot speak your mind, you cannot say what you mean. I had a very good associate and one of my mentors who constantly said, English, it's a difficult language. And he was being sarcastic because he was saying it generally when somebody didn't agree with him or didn't understand him, and it caused him to throw up his hands. But the reality is that when we know what we want, we can ask for it. And until we can speak in our own mind what it is we want and we wish to pursue, we can't pursue it because we aren't going to have the skills or the inclination even to achieve it. So you have to learn how to speak what's going on in your mind, what has come to the front. The entire Nycos Launchpad concept is my baby. I am trying to speak into existence the entire process for all of you to become part of it and use it for yourselves, because it's put me in a place where I have infinite joy. I know that sounds glib, and everybody has their own version of what happiness is, but the state of mind I am in is exactly where I've wanted to be all of my life, and this is where I was supposed to be. Now, that does tie into the active imagination compared to a passive visualization. You want to develop an active imagination because all of the effort to go from this realism, this real role in my life, to that real role in my life requires energy. And the anticipation between where we are and where we want to be is more than enough energy creation process to achieve it. But we have to actually focus on the active portion of our imagination to get there. You see, because the other half of it is uncertainty. And the uncertainty concept is that we cannot possibly know the future because we haven't gotten there yet. We can only see in fits and glimpses what might be. And therefore, we have to live in this uncertainty, leaning into the objective that we want with the energy to push forward so that we can accomplish. Because every accomplishment must involve risk, or else it is of no effect. If somebody told you you had the most average potato, in your garden. What good is that? What good is that reward? Most average of anything. That it seems irrational, right? The point here is that anything that we accomplish, if we accomplish it just because we accomplished it, has no value. This is I suppose you would call this the argument that is given for people when they speak of the modern generation and how they were given participation trophies just for showing up, and this was a bad thing. It was a bad thing, but it wasn't for the reason you might think. There's no net downside to being kind to people. There's no downside to recognizing their efforts. But there is a wrong way to face the risks of our lives, and that is by ignoring them. And to achieve any accomplishment, we have to have faced some risk. And so by taking the active imagination and applying it to the uncertainty principle, you create this cycle of energy that helps to fulfill something more important. Alrighty, so you got back from commercial before I even got there. That's pretty funny. So the last thing I was speaking about was talking about the fact that accomplishment involves risk. What all of this really comes down to is a different perspective on a phrase that we have all heard in our lives before. I'm certain you've probably heard this phrase before. It is not whether we win nor lose, but rather how we played the game. That's a phrase that gets overused, but just think about it for a minute. It's not whether you win or lose. It's not about the accomplishment, but it's about the method, the politeness, the cordial nature, the happy competitiveness, the enjoyment that we receive from the participation that determines our feelings when we come off of the game. It isn't whether we won or lost, but how well we played the game, how professionally, how thrilling or enjoyingly that we played the game. Alrighty, so we have now come to the end of the video. I've finished covering what I wanted to cover. I've gone 15 minutes longer than I normally do, so actually almost 30 minutes longer than we usually do. So I'm kind of excited about that because it may mean that I've got enough content now going on week over week, but we shall see. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I hope there's something that has really helped you. And if there is, please feel free to post in our comment section. If you have something you'd like to ask here, feel free to type it into the discussion. I am on to virtually every night of the week. I have situations in my life that keep me from getting here, but for the most part, I try to mix it up. Tomorrow's show is going to be recaps of all of the game sessions I'm currently running that are public. So if you want to know more about the world of Nycos and get some updates on the stories at each game session, we're going to be doing that on Sunday nights going forward. So if there's any topic you'd love us to cover, feel free to let us know. Let me go ahead and share with you our final screen because it gives you the updates on where you can find everything. If you want to know more about the Nycos roleplay game products and merchandise, you can check that out at www.NycosRPG.com. You can gain information on the lore of the story setting, Nycos, by going to NycosRPG.info. And if you want to join our Discord, of course, the Discord connection down below should be functioning. If it doesn't, PM me and I'll fix it. In the meantime, of course, you can also watch more videos here on Twitch at twitch.tv/NycosRPG, or you can check out our YouTube channel over at YouTube at NycosRPG. If you want to join our community and become part of what we're doing, please check out our joining link at www.patreon.com/join/Nycos. Thank you again for your time being here, and I hope to see you next time. I will be in my chat channel